And the last thing that I focus on in work with men is a psychoeducational focus. And that's because men really appreciate, I think, information. And so I'll be focusing on things like what are the dynamics of grooming, helping people understand the impacts of trauma, understand the impacts of trauma at different stages of child development, what are some of the impacts, understanding what is complex trauma, keeping up to date with the neuroscience, you know, what's the cognitive, physiological responses to trauma. So I find that men in particular find that normalising and relieving in the sense of, oh, okay, now I get it. It's not just about me. There's something else going on here. There are some broader understandings of what's happened to me.
Well, I think it's really important to have a very good understanding of trauma, and not only just trauma, but complex trauma, complex developmental trauma, we sometimes call it, because a lot of the men I see have been sexually assaulted as boys, and so how that plays out is a little bit differently to post-traumatic stress disorder, sort of single episode events that are not interpersonal perhaps. But so looking at trauma through the lens of a complex trauma history that's impacted on a child's development and their identity, you know, their understanding about their identity as a boy, as a man. And because it's somebody who owes them a duty of care, that kind of how it impacts trust issues. So trauma is a really powerful lens.
Coming from the trauma perspective, I think the notion that there are no irrational responses to trauma, so whatever the guy has done to deal with this stuff, that made sense at the time. It was a good strategy when he started. A lot of the guys come to us because the strategies they were working with have broken down, and that creates a kind of crisis in their life, and that's what brings them through the door. But they were things that originally they adopted to deal with the fact that they had trauma. That's particularly true in relation to childhood trauma.
Often habits and behaviours and responses to sexual abuse or sexual assault can be just a different way of coping at different times, which may be really quite useful and have a certain being worked for a person, functional for a person for a time. But then also to understand that some of those patterns then can not be as effective or become problematic in and of themselves.
And I also think very much of the term, in Gestalt therapy we call it a creative adjustment, that if we're always doing the best we can given the resources and the awareness and the constraints that we have inside us and outside us. Mm-hmm. And it's a very non-pathologizing perspective that that you can only do the best you can. And so a lot of what I find people's symptoms that are left over, you know, residues of sexual abuse and trauma, their symptoms are really creative adjustments. I often say today's symptom is yesterday's creative adjustment, like dissociation and self-blame and believing I'm worthless, that often those symptoms actually have helped us adapt, like blaming myself for what's happened to me can create an illusion of feeling more in control and less powerless, for instance. Or dissociation is a way to get away from overwhelming feelings. So it's adaptive. So that kind of model about everything that our symptoms are really adaptive in many ways, I think is important.
Currently in the field of doing this work, it's important to have some information and education around ideas about trauma, how people cope with traumatic experiences. Partly I think what's useful about that is often people feel, because they're feeling certain things or having certain thoughts about themselves or about the world, that they might have a sense that they're crazy or there's something wrong with them for having those thoughts and feelings. And I think one of the helpful things about trauma theory and information about trauma is a bit of reassurance that this is within a normal, common way that people cope with these kinds of overwhelming experiences can be to have strange thoughts or to have feelings that they've never felt before. And I think it's very important to have ways to assist people put that into context.
I think one of the really useful things that's come into our thinking in the last decade or more is the idea of complex trauma, because it helps us understand some of the stuff that the more clinical definitions of post-traumatic stress don't quite explain. It brings in the idea of the shift in meaning, the way you look at yourself and the world, religious and spiritual frameworks, just your sense of self that shifts and changes after life events which are traumatic. And that's not something that PTSD has necessarily in its diagnostic criteria. It also allows us to work in a different way with people where there isn't a single event trauma and where they can't say, look, all this stems from this one particular time. It's when people say, you know, it was that whole childhood that was full of shit. And that doesn't fit with some of the more contained models of trauma. Yet I think those contained models are also important.
Not everybody who suffers sexual abuse or sexual assault has to move into complex trauma, and some people don't. But most of the time we're seeing people who have a myriad of other difficult issues that have emerged either partly because they happened anyway before they were assaulted or abused, or have emerged after, and we're dealing with people with complex trauma. I think it's really important to have a very good background in child development, child and youth development and personal psychological development, because it's the key to understanding what happens to people, particularly with historical abuse, and what gets locked down into people's minds and thoughts as we work with them, what's happened with them internally when they come to us as men or as adolescents.
To be trauma aware, and that is to operate broadly within the framework of trauma-informed practice. So that means that you're focusing on supportive relationships, you're focusing on safety, you're focusing on understanding trauma, and focusing on hope and meaning. So understanding that broad framework of trauma-informed practice. Now, in the context of supportive relationships, this is absolutely key, because the therapeutic relationships needs to be safe. And for many men, the majority of men who've been sexually abused, there's a lack of safety, generally a lack of safety. And it's a very ironic thing, because the relationships in which they were abused were often intense, intimate, long-term relationships with adults. And what we're trying to do in the therapeutic context is actually develop intense, often safe, long-term, supportive relationships. And that relationship, if we're not careful, if we're not mindful, can actually be a place where abuse dynamics can get played out all over again. So the concentration as a therapist on the safety and the boundaries of the relationship are really important.
Another approach I find really helpful, and it really is useful for me in sustaining hope in the work that I do, is really challenging that sense of damage that fellows have, and really deconstructing where that idea comes from. I find neuropsychology really helpful in looking at that. The men really enjoy diagrams of brains and the amygdala and all of that sort of stuff. They find that really something that they can grab hold of and think about in some useful ways that doesn't include blame and shame and all of those sorts of things. So when you look at their responses, their coping strategies as adaptations, it follows then that as a learned response, it can be either unlearned or other responses learned as well. So there is then room for optimism, there's room for hope, there's room for change.
I think one of the things that I've found very, very important is the whole notion of learning how to become embodied again. And so one of my orientations is to reconnect with the body, reconnect with the felt sense of the body, because my experience is trauma leads people to become disconnected from their bodies and disconnected from their emotions. So one of the things that's important to me is supporting people to safely arrive back into their bodies through different ways, through mindfulness, through grounding, through positive, pleasurable experiences like yoga or dance or natural bushwalking, But that became very important in my own journey. So that's one guiding principle is I've done a lot of training around trauma and somatic experiencing training in the last 2 years. And so I've just more and more have developed an interest in the importance of helping people learn how to regulate their nervous systems as well as their emotional world. But a lot of people's nervous systems have become dysregulated because of long-term trauma or even acute trauma, one-off experiences. So supporting people to come back into their body and allow their nervous system to come back into homeostasis and to learn how to relax their nervous system has been a big part of the work.
If I have a goal for anyone I'm working with, and of course I want them to have their own goals, but if I have a goal or if I have a wish for them, it would be that the awful experiences that they've experienced in the past, the recollection of that has a past tense to it, that it doesn't have an ongoing present tense. That's really the core of it for me, that if they can come to a point where they say, this stuff was awful, and when I think about it, it's in the past tense, the thinking about it doesn't become a replication of the event, which then of course means they no longer have to construct their lives around avoiding the thinking about it. Because one of the things we know is that avoidance works in the short term, but overall it actually strengthens the memories. It strengthens that present tense of the memory because it's like the thing that we're avoiding becomes stronger as we avoid it. So that's probably the core of it for me.